Hello friends, how are you and welcome to the School of Dress Design Masterclass. I hope you enjoyed our previous video and that it was a benefit to you. I hope the videos will take you a step further to becoming an amazing fashion designer. Today I will show you how to apply various methods of bias binding. Are you ready? Well, let's get started. The warp thread in the fabric is the strong thread and it runs vertically to the self edge. The weft thread has almost no tension and is a weaker thread in the fabric. It runs horizontally to the self edge. The bias is any grain that falls between the straight and the cross grain. A true bias is when the grain is 45 degrees to its weft and warped thread. The bias allows the designer to cut clothing that requires stretch. In this case, the bias allows the binding to curve around the necklines and armholes. I cut the bias binding 4 centimeters wide. The neckline will be gathered before we apply the bias binding. Place the right side of the binding onto the right side of the garment and sew 1 centimeter. We are ready to apply the ditch stitch method. By folding the binding over to the wrong side of the fabric, the top stitch will be hidden right under the fold of your binding. This will be done on the right side of the fabric. The stitch on top is hidden under the fold of the binding. At the same time, we need to grab and secure the under part of the binding. As you can see, I'm sewing on the right side of the fabric, ensuring that my thread is hidden underneath the fold of the binding. At the same time, I'm securing the binding on the wrong side of the fabric as well. The thread is hidden under the fold of the bias binding, and here you can see like a top stitch on the wrong side of the fabric. Here I will show you how to apply top stitch on the right side of the garment. Place the right side of the bias binding onto the wrong side of the garment and sew 1 centimeter. Turn the bias binding over to the right side of the garment. Ensure that you are folding twice. There's 1, and there 2. Ensure that the center guideline on your machine foot is in line with the fold of the binding. Move the machine needle slightly to the side and apply the top stitch. There's your lovely top stitch on the right side of the garment. Now I will show you how to sew ready-made bias binding. This is a satin bias binding which can be bought on a roll and has been folded for you. The folds in the bias binding can be used as a guide while attaching it to the garment. Place the right side of the binding onto the wrong side of the garment and sew into the fold. Use the fold line on the bias binding as a guideline. Ensure that the guideline on the foot is in line with the fold on the bias binding. Now we can top stitch on the right side of the garment. Ensure that the guideline on the foot is in line with the fold of the bias binding and move your needle slightly to the right. This is what ready-made bias binding looks like. See the contrast top stitch? This binding finishes off a garment really nice. We can also use binding to serve as a hem for your garment. The binding can serve as a decorative feature on the top of your garment or on the wrong side of the garment. I would like my binding hem to show on the right side of the garment. Center the guideline on the machine foot onto the fold of the bias binding. Now you can turn your binding over completely and top stitch. Remember, you can turn the bias binding either on the right side of the fabric or on the wrong side of the fabric. Again, align the center guideline on your machine foot with the fold on the bias binding, not forgetting to move your needle slightly to the side. When hemming with the bias binding, you will see the bias binding on the one side of the garment. Like I said, it will appear either on the right side of the garment or the wrong side of the garment. That is your choice. And that's a wrap, guys. I hope you learned how to apply various methods of bias binding. Please like and subscribe. Hope you have a fabulous week ahead. See you next week.